everyone. All right, just want to let everyone get in and get settled, and then we will get started. Welcome everyone. Welcome to Piecing It Together, Best Practices and Common Pitfalls for Association Chapters, Subsidiaries, and Affiliates. It's a panel discussion with the Tenenbaum Law Group and your part-time controller. My name is Teresa Henderson, and I'm very happy that you've joined us here today. Before we get started, I just want to take care of some housekeeping details. We are using the On24 platform, and if you haven't used it before, I just want to share some helpful hints in terms of how you can use it. So first, I want to let you know that you can see and hear us, or hopefully you can see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. The boxes or the widgets, they're highly customizable. The slide box may be the default large box, but you can alter the sizes and the locations of the windows to suit your taste. So while I mention slides, the slides today will mostly have questions that the panelists will be discussing, but we'll send out the slides and it'll include contact information, and you should get it about 24 hours after the conclusion of today's session. So in the afternoon, if you're thinking East Coast time. And while the chat feature in On24, it's not activated, we do have a Q&A box, so be sure to type any questions that you have in that box and we'll answer it at the end of the session. We hope to be able to answer all of the questions live, but if we don't get to it, we will be sure to follow up with you after the session. And so with all that, we can begin. So the first slide. So again, my name is Teresa Henderson. I'm a manager in the YPTC Anywhere or the Remote Group. And I'm joined by my colleagues from YPTC, Larry Kaplan and Laura Meyer, both associates in the Washington, D.C. office. We're very excited today to be joined by Jeffrey Tenenbaum of the Tenenbaum Law Group. I'll turn it over to him to tell you about his firm, and then Laura will take over to give you information about YPTC and to serve as our moderator for the day. Jeff?
Thanks, Teresa. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those of you out on the West Coast. Welcome to our program today. I'm excited to be partnering up with your part-time controller and our firm, Tenenbaum Law Group. Just real quickly, in a few seconds, our firm is a 4-lawyer boutique firm based in Washington, D.C., also with the Chicago office. 4 lawyers, our paralegal, and our assistant, a 6-person lean, mean machine that focuses nothing but working with associations and nonprofit organizations, primarily as outside general counsel. So we deal with a very broad array of all of the different legal issues that nonprofits face. I've been doing this now for 26 years in DC in private practice, all of it representing associations and nonprofits, and not surprisingly have done extensive work over the years with association chapters, subsidiaries, and affiliates, which is informing all of the experience and the things that I'll be talking to you about here today. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. I'm Laura with your part-time controller, and very much like the Tenenbaum Law Group, we focus on working with nonprofit organizations to help with their financial needs. We've been in business for nearly 3 decades. We have 8 regional offices and YPTC Anywhere, working remotely nationwide. We're a professional services firm specializing in nonprofit financial management. We've currently got 1,300 plus clients, and we'd love for you to join us. With that, let's take a look at our learning objectives for the day. First, we'd like to review the unique characteristics of association corporate structures and share legal and financial considerations for managing chapters, affiliates, and subsidiaries. Second, we'll share some tips for mitigating legal and financial risk to the parent association. And finally, we'll learn legal and financial best practices for ensuring strong relationships between and among association chapters, subsidiaries, and affiliates. So we've got our first poll question for the day. Which type of organization are you joining us from today? If you'll take just a moment to answer that, and then we'll review our results. Okay, looks like we're about halfway there. Keep them coming. You more to go? Just a couple more. Come on. All right, let's take a look at who our audience is. Let's learn a little bit about all of you. Okay, it looks like we've got almost 40% from 501c3s, another almost 10% from 501c6s, and a whole bunch of people who just like YPTC webinars. That's fantastic. Okay, so looking at where everybody's from, that kind of brings us to, what does the IRS say an association is? An association is a group of persons banded together for a specific purpose. Now, given how broad that is, that kind of brings us to our first question for the panel today. Question number 1. What are the benefits, reasons for, and roles of chapters, subsidiaries, and affiliates in the association world? Teresa, I think you want to kick us off.
Sure. So great. It's a great lead in from the poll question. To start, I think we all know that for chapters, it's really a great way to expand that mission. In other words, if you want to increase your membership, add your services to another local area, chapters is a great way to do it. So it's really focusing on that core mission. Whereas if you're thinking about subsidiaries or affiliates, it might be that you want to expand in a particular area that is related to, but not directly related to that core mission. You want to take on new for-profit activities. You want to do more lobbying, and that doesn't fit within the guidelines or the rules or the structures of your primary the type of organization you're organized as. So again, lobbying is a great example. If you're organized as a C3 and you want to do more lobbying, you may decide that you want to set up an affiliate or a subsidiary that can help you with that. For-profit type activities. If you want to set up something that, again, will allow you to do more, maybe carry on something that's a regular trade in business and it's not directly related to that core nonprofit mission, subsidiary is a good option for that. And I'm sure Jeff has got lots of information to talk to and tell us about how we can do that.
Yeah, so there are, thanks, Teresa. There are many different reasons why an association, let's think of it as like the parent or the principal association, might set up a variety of different chapter subsidiaries and affiliates. The first thing I would distinguish, just so we're all talking about the same thing. When we say chapters, and different associations call them different things. Some call them sections, some call them regions. But for purposes of today's discussion, we're just going to call them chapters. Usually, they tend to be state and or regional and or local, kind of subparts of a broader national or international association. So they're often geographically limited. A national association might have a chapter in every state in DC. But sometimes they're also organized by subject matter expertise or, a job function or other things like that. There's no right or wrong, but there's, whenever we're talking about chapters, we're usually talking about smaller subdivided parts of a larger national or international organization. I refer to subsidiaries and affiliates. What I'm referring to are not chapters, but things like a 501c6 trade or professional association that sets up a related 501c3 foundation, or a 501c3 organization that sets up a related 501c4 advocacy arm to do unlimited lobbying and to engage in political campaign activity, or a 501c6 association or C3 that creates a wholly owned taxable subsidiary to engage in unlimited business activities that are maybe unrelated to the purpose and mission of the organization, but which can be pursued without limit in a for-profit subsidiary, which, by the way, can pay its profits in the form of dividends back to the parent, all tax-free. So those are the kind of the distinctions between, and a subsidiary is the word that's used when there's ownership. So for instance, think of a for-profit subsidiary like a C Corp that is solely owned by the parent association, or a single member LLC, limited liability company, where the C6 or the C3 is a sole member. So that's kind of the subsidiary. An affiliate is, say, another nonprofit organization. C6 when affiliated C3, C3 when affiliated C4, sometimes multiple C3, sometimes multiple C6s. So that's the vernacular. I wanted to make sure we're on the same page. What are some of the other reasons why you create subsidiaries and affiliates and chapters? Well, certainly for the chapters, getting local engagement, getting individual members engaged at the local level, state or local or regional level is often a very important part. Membership development. Many other reasons why national or international associations create state or local chapters, and sometimes overseas chapters as well, I should add. For subsidiaries and affiliates, there's lots of different reasons. Sometimes it's for liability protection, to create kind of a liability shield between the assets of one corporation and the assets of another, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit. Sometimes it's for tax reasons, like I just talked about. C6s can't take advantage of certain of the tax benefits, like ability to receive tax-deductible charitable contributions and a lot of grants that are limited to C3. So a lot of C6s will create an affiliated C3 foundation for that purpose. C3s are prohibited from engaging in any political campaign activity and are limited in how much lobbying. So if you're a C3 as a main entity, you often have the option of creating an affiliated either C4 or C6 organization to engage in unlimited lobbying and some political campaign activity. So sometimes it's driven by the tax code. I gave the example before of a for-profit sub that can engage in unlimited activities that might be considered unrelated business activities to the tax-exempt organization, but could be carried on an unlimited basis in a for-profit sub. And then sometimes there's other reasons that are not limited, not driven by the tax code. Talking about liability protection, a lot of nonprofits these days will create one or more different single-member LLCs, limited liability companies, which are disregarded for income tax purposes, but which can shield the liability risks of certain riskier activities and protect the assets of the parent association. We do those all of the time. Sometimes you want to have a separate board of directors, maybe for different purposes, different skill sets. Maybe you're really looking for a fundraising board for one entity. Sometimes you want, as you all know, tax-exempt organizations file this IRS Form 990 each year. It's a very public document. Sometimes if you're trying to go out there and generate new revenues, grants, contributions, if the organization has too much assets, it might not be an attractive target for fundraising, but if you create a separate entity that has a very different looking Form 990, it might be easier. So there's lots of different reasons. There are many more as well, sometimes political, sometimes public relations, sometimes membership driven, but regardless, that hopefully gives you an overview of some of the reasons why we talk about these things.
Because that's fantastic. It sounds like setting up that structure appropriately really depends on what your goals are as an organization. And given the really broad definition of an association and all of that complexity, I think it leads us right into our next question.
Actually,
what are some helpful ways?
We did have a question from people are posing some questions in the Q&A box, and there's one that's related to what we just talked about. Someone asked, is an IRS designated supporting organization considered a subsidiary? So technically, to answer your question, no, but it would be considered what I call a controlled affiliate. So a supporting organization, just real quickly, all 501c3s are subclassified into public charities or private foundations, and it's much more beneficial to be a public charity, but to do so, you have to meet one of the 4 different public support tests. One of those public support tests is what's called a supporting organization. And this is how we often, when you have a C6 association that's setting up a related foundation as a C3, we generally set it up as a supporting organization. I have a whole article on our website if anyone's interested in more in this topic. But the bottom line is a supporting organization is a typical way that we would structure a related C3, but it's considered an affiliate, not a subsidiary.
Okay. Great. So that's a wonderful lead into our next question, which is, what are some helpful ways to mitigate legal and financial risk to the parent association? I think, Jeff, do you want to take the lead on that one?
Sure. So again, lots and lots of different ways to help mitigate legal, financial, and I should probably add tax risk as well to that. Some of those are interrelated. And I'll let my other colleagues from YPTC on the phone today deal with more on the financial side. But on the legal and tax side, a few key things that are really important to do to help mitigate risk to them. When I say parent, we're talking about either the owner of subsidiaries or the controlling part of, one or more other nonprofit or, nonprofit affiliates. So one of the most important things to do of course, one of the main reasons that, as I talked about in the answer to the first question, why we set up these subsidiaries and affiliates is for liability protection and for tax reasons. Because, under the tax code, one type of entity, one type of 501c entity can't do certain things or is limited in it, whereas others don't have those sort of restrictions. But in order to get the benefit of that, we have to make sure that both the IRS as well as anyone who might, like on the liability protection side, like a plaintiff that might bring a lawsuit forward, we want to make sure that the corporate veil between the entities is not pierced. What that means is that we want the IRS or the courts, if it was ever a case being litigated, to respect the separate corporate and tax status of the different entities. Because if a court or the IRS determines that one of these entities, is a mere instrumentality of the other, that it so overlaps the other entity, the governance structure is basically the same, one entity is just really controlling the other and is almost treating it like a division or department of that primary entity. If that's the case, then the corporate veil can be pierced and the liability protection goes away. And all of a sudden, from a tax perspective, it becomes a really dangerous situation because, you take a C3 and a C6 and you combine them. If the court or an IRS combine them and you end up with a C6, you would lose a C3 status. And so, from that perspective, it's really important to not let the corporate veil be pierced. So how do we avoid piercing the corporate veil? Well, if you look at, I've read through tons of the cases in this area, and they always look to a number of different things. They look to things like, are the board of directors of the entities identical? Are the officers identical? You always want to have at least some folks who are officers and directors of one entity that are not officers, directors, or employees of the other entity. I usually refer to those as kind of independent directors, or independent officers. And while they don't have to be completely separate, you want to have some separate between the two. Now, that being said, you can create it, like we often use a structure, say a C6 is creating a C3 foundation. We often set it up where the C6 is the sole member of the C3, has the ability to appoint all of the directors and sometimes even the officers of the related C3. But in terms of who is sitting on that C3 board and who are the C3 officers, you want to make some of them different from the folks who are on the C6 board. Other corporate formalities, separate bank accounts, obviously separate EIN numbers, holding separate board meetings, separate meeting minutes. Each party, when it enters into contracts, it should enter into the contracts in its own name. Don't just have one entity enter into all the contracts. There's lots of different corporate formalities like that, but treating them like they are two separate entities. If one entity, for instance, the C6 is going to be providing staffing services to the C3, even though those services are allowed from a tax law perspective to be donated and you don't have to be reimbursed for them, you still want folks to track their time, keep timesheets, treat that donated time as a donation to the C3. These are all different corporate formalities. And then finally, and this is really important for subsidiaries, affiliates, and chapters, the importance of a written affiliation agreement is really, really important. That will govern everything from a trademark license to use the name and logo of the parent association, to restrictions on how that logo can be utilized, to all of the other kind of rights and obligations of the parties, having the ability to appoint the board members of the other entity, all of these sorts of things. With chapters, essentially containing a charter for the chapter to operate, say, in that geographic region, giving a license to use the trademark, what services the national, the parent organization is going to provide, what obligations are on the chapters for reporting back to the national. Maybe if there's a group exemption involved, there's certain information that has to be reported back to the national each year. What happens if the chapter does something bad and loses its kind of charter from the national organization, making clear that it no longer has the right to use the association's name and logo or hold itself out as being affiliated with the national, things like that. So a written affiliation agreement with every chapter, subsidiary, and affiliate is a really, really important way to help mitigate risk. I turn it over to you guys to cover the kind of non-legal financial issues.
Well, to add on to Jeff's comment, especially regarding group exemptions, your parent company wants to ensure that your chapters, specifically if they fall under the group exemption, are filing their returns. So you want to have good internal controls to make sure that that's done. The last thing you want to have happen is a chapter that fails to file a 990 loses its exemption. And so there's a report the IRS will send out every year. The parent should get that and review it and go over that with making sure the chapters get that as well. Also, you want to make sure there are good internal controls in place. So with all of these legal ramifications, you want to have good internal controls from the parent and clear understanding with the chapters and the affiliates that those are maintained and they're checked on regularly.
I think the other thing, too, I just want to add on, pick up where Larry's left off on internal controls. One of the things that I think the pandemic has done, it's really allowed us, the rest of the world, to kind of catch up with, especially in the nonprofit world, the rest of the world to catch up with the way that maybe associations have had to operate all along. In other words, associations have had chapters that might be regionally or locally dispersed in a lot of different areas, and they've got to find a way to kind of work together and communicate together. And so along with that, a lot of tools have come along that might facilitate being able to work together but separately. So a lot of our clients at YPTC use bill.com, and that will really help a lot with the internal controls, being able to monitor, who's approving what documents, as well as also kind of locking down, who has access to be able to release payments. So I know that when, you're dealing with volunteer boards, you may have to deal with actually transferring physical checks from one administration to the next, and getting those old names off the signature card and the new names on the signature card might have been, required actually physically meeting and therefore maybe dragged out too long. So now with some of these tools that really have made treasury services more accessible to more people, I think that those are also things that you want to think about incorporating in terms of management of those chapters and management of those volunteer boards.
Yeah, that's the great advice, Teresa. And, I will say over the 26 years that I've been doing this, most of the examples of fraud and embezzlement that I've seen in the association world by far have occurred at the chapter level, not at the national. Unfortunately, I've seen it and had to deal with it way too many times. And it's often because they just lack this sort of rigorous internal controls. And you guys know this way better than I do, that it typically exists at a larger network. It is so.
Yeah, absolutely. We love internal controls as accountants. But discussing all of the potential risks kind of leads us on to our next question. Jeff, would you like to talk a little bit about this? What are some of the common pitfalls in associations' relationships with their chapters, subsidiaries, and affiliates? And how can these pitfalls be best mitigated?
Yeah, it's another big question. There are many pitfalls, potential pitfalls, and there are certainly many tools that I've seen for mitigating them. But I'm going to focus on kind of the legal side of things, and I'll let the other folks on the call kind of comment on some of the other issues. Not to say that the legal are more important than the other, but since you're asking me and I'm going first, I'll give you some of the more legal reasons. One thing is, I'm a big fan when I'm representing, say, the parent association, which I usually am, and we're creating one or more subsidiaries or affiliates or even chapters, particularly with subsidiaries and affiliates. I'm a big fan of building in as much control as possible. And I often refer to it as a belt suspenders approach for control. Because, the last thing you want to do is stand up a new entity for whatever reason, for tax reasons, liability protection reasons, fundraising reasons, whatever else. I went through the list earlier. You don't want to set it up. Usually, you help subsidizing the formation. Maybe you're capitalizing, and if it's a for-profit sub, or you're loaning it money, or you're giving it a grant, or whatever the case is, you don't want to have a chance that it becomes a runaway affiliate in the future. And I've unfortunately seen that happen way too many times. But when I have seen it happen, it's because the organizations did not have any belt suspenders approaches in there for control. Now, this is so much more difficult to do if you don't set it up that way in the beginning, right? When you're setting it up in the beginning, I just had a call earlier today with a C3 client. We're going to be creating an affiliated 501c6 entity because they engage in certification and accreditation activities in part that the IRS has said are not consistent with the tax exempt status of a C3, but are consistent with the exempt status of a C6. So we're going to create an affiliated C6 that's going to be completely controlled. C3 is the sole member of the C6. C3 has the ability to appoint and remove all the directors and officers of the C3. of the C6, the C3 has the ability to approve all amendments to the Articles of Incorporation and bylaws, maybe even approving the annual budget of the affiliated C6. We kind of maximize control, still somewhat separate board of directors, but we lock all that in through the sole membership structure, for instance, having the C3 be the sole member of the C6, locking it into the bylaws and articles and saying those can't be amended without the approval of the parent. And then also kind of a third belt and suspenders approach, locking it in through a written affiliation agreement, which I said earlier is critically important. It's easy to do that when you're starting out from the beginning. It's a lot harder to do that with an existing entity, because usually once an entity's been around for a while, its board typically doesn't want it to give up control to another entity. So it's a lot harder to put these things in place once you've already had organizations that are in place for a while. But of course, it all depends on the nature of the relationship between the entities. But that's really important to kind of maximize the control to the greatest extent possible, while still maintaining the corporate formalities and making sure that the corporate veil doesn't get pierced between them. With chapters, to me, the biggest risk is a chapter that kind of goes off the reservation, and then you don't have the ability to pull back its ability to hold itself out as being a chapter of your organization or using your organization's name. Happens all of the time. I think it's really important for national or international organizations to have really tight control over their chapter's ability to be affiliated with them and to use the name, and that's where a really good chapter affiliation agreement comes into place. Of course, there's lots of other things that are going to go into the chapter affiliation agreement, in terms of operational expectations, reporting and inspection. Perhaps there's going to be a joint dues collection, membership dues collection. If there's a group exemption, there's going to be certain requirements, maintaining a model set of bylaws. Some types of chapters you're going to require that they incorporate as a nonprofit corporation, maintain their nonprofit corporate status, maintain their IRS tax exempt status, whether through a group exemption or even if they have their own individual exemption. And so all of those things get written into the affiliation agreement as well. Why don't I stop there and turn it over to you guys to get some other thoughts?
Well, I will pick up on
Larry. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Larry.
Yep. I was going to say, I'll pick up on the dues issue. One of the things with chapters, you want to be sure that you're not competing for the same dollars. Your parent and your chapter need to coordinate and have good communication so that, if a chapter is looking to do an event or do fundraising, they're not going after the same dollars that the parent is getting, trying to do the same thing. So having that type of communication is key between both the chapters and affiliated organizations. Other pitfalls that I've seen, your parent organization doesn't want to play favorites. You don't want to have them having favorite chapters. So that make sure you have a good perception throughout your organization that it's an equitable arrangement. Dues, that's another big issue when we look at due structure and how that's done. Especially now with the way the market has been, a lot of organizations may be reevaluating their due structure and looking to do a dues increase. Is it being equitable then to your chapters as well? Are you taking that into consideration? I've seen where one organization had a national dues level that was set and structured, and increases were built in every year based on, for instance, a rolling average of 3-year, CPI index. I've also seen the horror story where a national decided they needed the extra money, raised the dues, and it then turns into squeezing out, your chapters. So you need to be cognizant of that. As far as your financial planning and making sure that you keep your chapters aware and in the loop to bring all that in together. And one other aspect of that, of course, comes into international chapters, which is your due structure equitable to those? And, are you charging something that is exorbitant for people in other parts of the world? You just want to be aware of that if you're, maintaining or looking to do international chapters.
Yeah, and I think this can kind of relate to that. You want to make sure that you've got good reporting, right? Good reporting so that your individual chapters understand what's happening to all the dues and how are those being divided and how are those being applied and what's the value that you're bringing. And so that really can come through, good reports, but good reports that are meaningful to both individual and chapter members. Jeff, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on Larry's comment about international chapters. I haven't really given much focus or attention to that here today, and we don't have much time to do that. But I do want to say international chapters or affiliates, whatever you want to refer to them as, are a different animal than domestic chapters, without any question. They're a lot more different and complex. And, for instance, legal and tax structure is going to vary country by country, even, developed countries. Like in Europe, country by country, there's different structures for different types of associations and nonprofits. And so just recognize that, the legal and contractual relationship that, say, the parent association, say it's based in the U.S., is going to have with those different entities. It's going to be a bit different country by country. You're not going to use kind of the same. We actually just yesterday were working on 2 new kind of template affiliation agreements for an association client, one for their domestic chapters and one for their overseas chapters. And they look very different. Even our own template our firm uses are very different for those two. So just keep that in mind. We do have a question here for me. Do you typically see territory lines spelled out in the affiliation agreement, or does that pose potential antitrust risk? It's a good question. So first off, to the extent we're talking about, like you new chapter that's forming, today, we're giving you the charter that you'll be the Texas chapter, of the ABC Association. And so your charter is for Texas, and yours is New Mexico, and yours is California, or however you subdivide it. That's absolutely fine, and that does not pose any antitrust risk. What you're getting at with antitrust risk here is what's called market allocation. It's a serious antitrust violation for 2 or more competitors to agree to allocate markets, meaning I'll only compete in this market and you only compete in this market, and we agree not to compete with each other. And if an association were to facilitate some sort of market allocation, it could get the association really into trouble as well, because the association is, by definition, a combination of competitors. But here we're not talking about, they're not competitors at all. They're just different chapters. And so there's no, I agree not to compete in your market, and you agree not to compete in mine. So that does not pose any antitrust risk. And yes, that geographic subdivision would typically be spelled out in the regulation.
Great, thanks. It seems like there's a lot of potential areas to engage in some risks. So what are some of the top financial administration solutions in this area? Larry, do you want to pick that up?
Sure. So with membership associations, your AMS system, your association management system, is really, the lifeblood of your organization. That's where you're tracking all of your member activity. And, there are a lot of systems out there that will be able to do that, in addition to helping track chapters, keep track of all your events, everything your member does and touches and what they do. But it also can keep track of all of your financial information as well. A very good structured AMS system can, in essence, become a subledger for your accounting system that'll feed that information in. So you really want to have the right technology for your type of operation that you can integrate and keep all that information in. The other thing is you want to be able to share that information. So if you have a chapter structure or even any of your affiliates, that you want to be able to produce reports that will then be able to share that information with them and have that specific to what they need to see as well. So if you have a membership association, a C6 with a related C3, you should be able to keep track of all that information and be able to produce reports for both entities. Same with your chapters. If you're collecting dues for them, have you got a process in place that you're keeping track of their dues and making sure that they have a good understanding of what their financial situation is? You also want to be able to perform any financial review if your chapters are keeping track of their own information. This goes back with the internal controls part. Do you do a review of their financials to make sure that they're maintaining a healthy status as well, if they're tracking their own information? So having a review on a regular basis, even a site visit or an audit of what they're doing, make sure that you keep a good practice in place and you keep good, healthy affiliates and chapters.
And again, when we think about a lot of the chapters, a lot of those chapters are run by volunteer organizations or volunteer individuals and or very lean administrative staffs. So how can you help, support them at the parent organization? Can you offer onboarding training? Can you offer things like finance calendars so they understand what the compliance deadlines are and give them enough lead time so that they can fit that within their meeting schedule and still help you meet your overall financial dates and deadlines. Now, again, kind of going back to what I had mentioned earlier about the new things that the remote working environment has made possible, document storage is much more easily a good way to transfer document storage from one administration to the next, or to easily transfer from one individual to another. Password protection, since we're, again, all working remotely, there are a lot of opportunities to implement these tools, to package and implement and share these tools with some of your local chapters. Just, again, this is going back to mitigating risk, but also to help them with their operations so that they take that off the table. They don't have to worry about that and can really get about the business of focusing on your mission.
Thanks, Teresa. A few other things, and I don't know if we consider these financial administration solutions, but one thing I've seen a lot, I don't really get involved in writing or reviewing these, but I've seen a lot, like as part of a lot of times, well, kind of the model construct where you have, say, chapters is to have an affiliation agreement with the chapters, and the affiliation agreement has certain documents that it incorporates by reference. And one will often be a chapter handbook. That's something that's kind of put out by the national or international organization, and has all sorts of kind of operational and financial details. So here's the processes of what you chapter, X, that's chartered by us. Here's what you have to do each month or each year. And everything from things like basic filings, like the IRS Form 990 filing, both with the IRS and in their home state. Presuming that if they're incorporated, most states require that you file what's called an annual report in that state in order to maintain your corporate status. All of those sorts of things, whatever sort of reporting back up to the national or international organization is required, each month or each quarter or whatever it is. I've mentioned before inspection rights, that the national organization can request additional documents, bank statements, and other things if it wants to, if it feels it needs to for certain purposes to ensure compliance. So all of those things should be reflected in kind of that chapter handbook that should have a lot of the financial and other operational kind of guidelines and requirements for the chapter. Of course, with subsidiaries and affiliates, if it's a controlled subsidiary, like you guys know better than me, but the auditors, the rules governing audits say that if one entity has the ability, either has majority ownership of, it's a for-profit sub, or for a nonprofit, the ability to appoint a majority of the board members of another, then the two entities or more entities can be consolidated for audited financial statement purposes. But still keep in mind, even if they're consolidated for financial statement purposes, they're still separate legal entities, separate for tax purposes. So they all have to file their own Form 990 if they're an exempt organization, or the form, the corporate tax return if they're a for-profit organization. And then finally, someone had a question about how should we file for, I think it means chapters. So one thing that a lot of folks get, and this does fit into this question, a lot of people get confused about is for chapters, tax exempt status versus Form 990 filing requirement. So you've heard Larry and I refer several times to a group exemption. A group exemption is this kind of umbrella exemption that, say, a national organization can get that would apply to all of its chapters, so long as they meet certain requirements, like have a common set of bylaws, common mission and purpose, same tax categories, 501c3 or c6 as the parent organization. So this is separate. It's kind of like, it's an extension of the parent's tax exempt status that provides this umbrella exemption to all of the chapters that fit within those rules. And then the national organization essentially is acting as an agent of the IRS in ensuring that they are complying with the rules for tax exemption. And then the national files this letter each year with the IRS listing the names and EIN numbers of all the chapters that are in the group, any that have been added, any that have dropped off, etc. That's the tax exempt status. So that means the individual chapters don't have to file their own IRS Form 1023 or 1024 applications to apply for their own exempt status. But separate and apart from that, every or most exempt organizations, things like churches accepted, have an obligation to file some form of the Form 990 with the IRS each year. the full Form 990, the 990EZ, or the 990N, depending on the size of the organization. And it's really important that, and this is, again, one of the financial administration requirements, that you make sure that the chapters are all filing the Form 990, whatever version of it is, each year, because if they fail to file 3 years in a row, they will automatically lose their exempt status, and they cannot get it back by being added back into the group exemption.
Right. Go ahead. Go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to say, we've talked a lot about that. It seems like a really good segue into the strategies that you can implement with these tools. So our next question, unless Teresa, you had something else you wanted to add there.
No, really just talking a lot about, again, about Jeff mentioned the combined reports, and so that kind of ties in nicely with the 990 and whether or not they're reporting separately. Often the parent organization is still needing to get that financial information from those chapters. They need to be able to either roll that information up into their corporate return and then therefore their corporate corporate financial statement and then their corporate return, or they need to make sure, as Larry and Jeff have said, that they're filing and producing that individually. And so again, me just talking about a little bit about the tools and just what's out there. There are things out there now that will help chapters be able to communicate their financial information in a way that makes sense to them, but maybe data map it so that it rolls up and more consistently, so that number one, at the parent organization, you can see what's happening across the organization, but number two, that you can ensure that you're getting that financial information, and three, staying on top of how that information is being translated and filed at the end of the year. Is it rolled up into the corporate 990, or are those individual chapters filing individually? So, and so with that, I can definitely turn it over, and I know the next question relates to that.
Yeah, let me just add one thing, just to make sure everyone's on the same page and there's no misunderstanding. So there's a group, I said difference between the exemption, group exemption, and then the annual Form 990 filing requirement. There is something called a group return, a group Form 990 return. It's rarely ever utilized. And I think it's what you were referring to, Teresa, but I just want to make sure people understand this is something that's rarely utilized. It's basically for like a national chapter situation. If it wanted to, the parent organization could file it doesn't get rolled up into the parent Form 990. It would be a separate Form 990 group return that has all of the chapter's information aggregated together. And there is an option for the, essentially the parent to file that group return on behalf of the chapters, and that would obviate the need for the chapters to file their own returns. But like I said, even with group exemptions, it's a rarely utilized process. So while there may be important reasons why the national wants to get financial data and reporting from the chapters, lots of good reasons, it's not generally ever driven by the tax code. It's not a tax code issue.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
I did see before we go on, Laura, I did see one question, somebody asking about recommendations for an AMS system. There are so many that are out there. Really, it's specific to what your needs are and what you need to have. And there are a lot of places you can get good comparisons between what they do and how they work. But as I said, you do want to make sure that whatever you're getting, you're able to then integrate and work with your financial system. The last thing you want to have to do is duplicate efforts between what you're tracking in your AMS and your membership data and your events and such, and then recreate it all in a financial system. So we really want to not have to duplicate that type of work.
Absolutely. So we've talked about some of the tools. Let's talk about some of the strategies for implementing some of those tools. So Teresa, do you want to talk a little bit about what are strategies for ensuring successful, healthy, enduring relationships between associations and their affiliate entities and avoiding tensions between them?
Well, I will really just start out to talk about, again, to build on the communication that I think both Larry has mentioned, as well as Jeff, in terms of making sure things are ironed out and up front. Really want to make sure that you're able, that at the parent organization and even across chapters, that you've got a way to communicate that information. And again, with YPGC, our primary focus typically is really working to provide financial information, those aren't really the only metrics that we can help you. We can also present this, because that's not the only part of the story, right? We can also help you present non-financial information, because the non-financial or the programmatic information is not as meaningful without the financial information, and vice versa. And so that's really where we want to start, and one of the areas that we work with all of our clients, but I think is especially helpful for our association clients, given how many different sort of chapters, if they're using the chapters, are helping them to implement their mission. And so Jeff may really want to talk about, kind of talking about those agreements and how, making sure that you've got those things ironed out would be helpful for chapter members.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. So, I couldn't agree more. Communication is so key. And unfortunately, I deal with a lot of tension-filled situations between, say, national or international associations and their state or local chapters, or sometimes overseas chapters. Unfortunately, it happens a lot, and going through one pretty nasty dispute right now. And, there's just a lot of mistrust by the chapters of the national. Sometimes, like, the national decided it really needed to roll out a new chapter affiliation agreement because the old one was woefully deficient. But then, when the chapters see some of the new obligations on them in the chapter affiliation agreement, they're like, oh my God, they're trying to take control of us. They want our money. They want to tell us what to do. See those kind of dynamics all the time. So transparency, open communication is really important. And you want the legal documentation, particularly the central document, that chapter affiliation agreement in those situations, to be clear and to cover all the different issues so that there's no confusion about that. If you're rolling out something new, you got to have an education campaign. You can't just kind of shove it down the throats of the chapters and expect them to sign it. It's always difficult transitioning from one chapter structure to another, or from or a bad affiliation agreement to a good one. It's always a difficult process, but the communication part is key. With subsidiaries and affiliates, kind of very different issue. To me, the more the control by the parent organization can be maximized, the stronger the relationship is going to be. The times that I see tension between two, and working with several clients right now that have that, they really don't have enough control built in from the get-go, and that's really causing some problems. Having good board overlap, having, for instance, maybe the top 3 officers of the parent association serve ex officio as board members of the subsidiary or affiliate. Having that sort of interlocking director, as it's called, can be important. Sometimes, once in a while, holding joint meetings between the different boards, doing joint strategic planning. Nothing wrong with that. As long as you're respecting kind of the separate corporate and tax status of each entity. But those sorts of things will build, you basically want, when you have this family of entities, we have some clients that have 6 or 7 or 8 different entities, in terms of subsidiaries and affiliates. You really want it operating as one central organization, not the technical parts of it. I already got into the importance of keeping everything separate, but you want to have a common strategic vision. You want to all be marching down the same step. You have different subsidiaries and affiliates set up for different legal, tax, financial, and other reasons. But you still want it to really operate with a single vision, a single mission, a single focus. And that's really important to maintain, I think, healthy relationships between the parent and the subsidiaries and affiliates.
Absolutely. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So go ahead.
Actually, there's a good question here, if I can jump in. A common problem I run into is that both staff and donors don't understand our corporate structure with the various affiliates. Donors will sometimes give to the parent organization and then the affiliate. Fundraisers want to claim those dollars because they say the donors don't realize the money doesn't automatically go to the local affiliate. They think we're conflating chapter subsidiaries and affiliates here. But bottom line, I get the question. It's a good one. It is a common problem, and not, I just 2 seconds ago talked about how, you want to operate as kind of one unified kind of family of organizations kind of marching to the same step. At the same time, you have these different subsidiaries and affiliates or chapters for reasons. And, you have to make clear that donors and grantors and funders and members understand what the different entities are, the roles that they play, who they're giving money to, whether they're giving to the national or to a chapter. all of that, clear communication, really good, very helpful org chart, with any explanation that people can readily understand kind of this family of entities and what they all mean and what they all do, and good education of all the relevant folks involved is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Communication is incredibly important. And we've got a couple of really great questions in the Q&A, if you guys have a few minutes to answer those. Okay, great. So I think we saw, it was, okay. So this was a great one. Back to an earlier question when we were talking about tools. Teresa, I think this would be a good one probably for you, and then we can all chime in, but can you name some of those specific tools for treasurers that overcome distance, or potentially cite a reference for this?
Okay, sure. So one of the things I did talk about is kind of a payment method, so something to help boards that are trying to process payments to their vendors. In other words, something like a bill.com, what it does is it automates an approval flow. So different people in different locations can approve payments and release payments. What it also does is it limits what that bank will recognize. So in other words, if whereas you used to have old check stock, that might be out there and multiple people running around with old check stock that could be lost or stolen. Now it will automatically, that you can communicate with the bank, and only those checks that the current board, the current active signers are allowing can be approved and will be cleared by the bank. Again, I mentioned document storage, passwords. So there are a lot of different things that enable you to work remotely that you can empower only the active group of chapter members or chapter officers or leaders to basically be able to operate the things that you want them to be able to operate. Again, reporting tools and data mapping, I think those are all things that will help you get information from volunteer members who may not be comfortable with and may not understand a lot of the complexities that Jeff has explained and gone over today, and that the parent organization knows are important, but they're volunteers. They don't have time to be experts in that kind of thing. And so we can, as a parent organization or as contractors that work with parent organizations, help their members to give everybody what they need to stay in compliance.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
I think
Teresa.
we've definitely found. So there's a great question actually for Jeff here. It's what's the best structure approach to having a large amount of chapters across the country without each chapter becoming their own organization?
Thank you. I saw that and I thought it was a great question too. Just real quick, someone else had asked a question about a 501c2 holding company. I think it's a little too specific for this webinar, but just if you email me offline, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But for this particular question, so I'm glad you brought this up, because I just had a conversation with a association client yesterday about this. So with chapters, association chapters, you have kind of two options. One is each chapter can be its own separate legal entity. That's the norm. That's how it usually works. Whether they're incorporated or not, they don't have to be. There's something called an unincorporated association, which is what an entity would be if it chooses not to incorporate. And believe it or not, there are a lot of state and local and regional chapters of national associations out there that have chapters that are, say, governed by a group exemption, but they're not separately incorporated. And that's okay as long as they meet the requirements for the group exemption. But they're still a separate legal entity, which means they have their own EIN number. That's always the hallmark of whether it's a separate legal entity. Forget about incorporation, but if it has its own EIN, it's a separate legal entity, then you want to have an affiliation agreement in place with those entities. You perhaps want to have a group exemption in place to provide this umbrella tax exemption for them. But the other model is where the chapters are not separate legal entities. And you could really just think of them as kind of branch offices of the parent association. So they are you and you are them. They don't have a separate EIN. If they have their own bank accounts, they're using the EIN of the parent. If they're signing contracts, they're signing contracts in the name of the parent association. You can probably see where I'm going with this. If you got all volunteer-run local chapters and they're not separate legal entities, there's some real risk because everything they do or fail to do creates a liability risk for the parent association because they are them. they're all one and the same. And so if you're going to do that, especially if you're going to let them sign contracts and have bank accounts, you got to have really, really tight controls over how they operate. Like I have one client that has that structure, and no one's allowed to sign any contracts without national office staff signing off of them, things like that. The more kind of, I'd say, common approach in that situation is to have the national office kind of bring on some extra staff and just manage all that for the chapters. So they don't have their own bank accounts, they don't sign their own contracts, things like that. You have it done by the national organization. So those are really the two options, and whether it's a C3 or a C6 or whatever, same basic construct here, same rules.
Okay, great. And I don't really know enough necessarily about the chapter breakdown, specifically in the legal ramifications of that to know, but you might have already covered this. We got another great question, which was, do you have any special advice for an association with a federated system of chapters?
Yeah, so I answered that question privately. And sorry, I didn't tell you that, but I mean, a federated model is, typically, what you think of as you got, say, a national, maybe you have state associations, state chapters, and then you have local chapters. And generally, like, to be a member of the national, you have to be a member of the state association or vice versa or things like that. That's what's typically referred to as a federated model. That's generally what we see for most associations. It's not always like that. But basically, like I told you in my private response, this is basically what we're talking about today when it comes to chapters, is kind of that basic federated model. There's all different ways to do this. Sometimes there's common dues collection, sometimes there's not. But anyway, that's pretty much what we've been talking about here today.
Great, thank you. I think we're just about out of time. Thank you so much to everybody for hanging in there with us for the whole hour. We really appreciate it. One quick thing, I did see a note in the chat about this. YPTC is hiring. If you'd like to join a best place to work, you can check us out. And please look for a save the date for our next webinar coming up August 25th, 2 p.m., direct route cost allocations, super important accounting stuff. And you can check out our Mission Business podcast anywhere that you get your podcast. So look for it on our website. We interview and talk to national nonprofit leaders. Fantastic. You'll receive a copy of the slides and the recording approximately 24 hours after the end of the presentation, like Teresa said, so you can look for it tomorrow afternoon Eastern time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure.